All right, let's dive deep into the final years of Francisco Franco in Spain. We're going behind the scenes during a period of massive change
Allá.
using a transcript from a D-Max España documentary called
Oh.
Los últimos años Franco, la vida del dictador en color.
It's fascinating stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What was really happening as Franco's hold on power started to weaken, were there any signs of what was coming next?
Well, it's interesting because we're not just looking at a historical figure.
Okay.
We're looking at a period where the future of Spain was totally up in the air. And you can
Hmm.
really see that play out as Franco's health begins to deteriorate. Like by the early 70s,
Yeah.
he's dealing with Parkinson's disease, severe phlebitis. He even delegates power to Juan Carlos for the first time.
Wow, that's a big deal
Oh, yeah.
for a man who held absolute power for decades.
Right?
Was there any sense that the end was near?
Absolutely. The whole world was watching very closely. The transcript even mentions that Richard Nixon sent an emissary to Spain.
Basically, to ask what would happen after Franco. You can imagine the tension.
Yeah,
And Franco, always the politician,
of course.
assured them that Juan Carlos would continue his moderate rule. He even declared that his true monument wasn't some statue or building,
Interesting.
but the Spanish middle class,
Mhm.
which gives us a glimpse into how he wanted to be remembered.
Trying to control the narrative, even as his health was failing.
Right.
But then 1973 happens. Prime Minister Luis Carrero Blanco is assassinated by ETA.
Right.
The transcript says Franco is just devastated, unable to even attend the funeral. What kind of impact did this event have on the regime?
Well, this was more than just a personal loss for Franco. This was a major blow to the regime's stability. It exposed the growing divisions within Franco's own government.
Hmm.
You had the immobilists who wanted to keep that hardline authoritarian approach, and then you had the aperturists who favored some degree of liberalization.
Okay.
And these factions, with their completely different visions for Spain's future, become key players in the years that follow.
As Franco's grip loosens, these conflicts come to the forefront.
Exactly.
And then there's the looming question of succession. The transcript mentions Franco's family, the Clan del Pardo, pushing for Alfonso, who was engaged to Franco's granddaughter. They seem to favor
Right.
a continuation of Francoism, but maybe a more dynastic approach.
Yes, and it highlights that even within a dictatorship, there are power struggles and competing visions.
Hmm.
But Franco remained committed to Juan Carlos as his heir,
Right.
which raises the question, was this genuine faith in Juan Carlos or a calculated move to maintain control even after his death?
Fascinating. It feels like there's this constant back and forth,
Yeah.
between maintaining the old order and these forces of change that are starting to emerge.
Yeah.
But as we move into those final years for Franco, the transcript points to a much darker side as well. There's
Yeah.
this resurgence of violence, especially from ETA, and Franco's response is brutal.
This is crucial. In 1975, he signed 5 death sentences for ETA and FRAP members. This sparked international condemnation, and it drew parallels back to similar events that happened back in 1946.
So even in his final year, he was willing to use extreme measures to maintain control.
It seems that way.
And in his last public appearance, he blames a Masonic leftist conspiracy for the criticism. He almost sounds paranoid,
Right.
clinging to the past as his health deteriorates. What was happening in those final months?
Well, the transcript paints this picture of a man battling multiple health crises.
Oh, wow.
It even mentions that the American network, ABC, mistakenly announced his death prematurely.
Really?
Yeah, but beyond just the physical decline, you sense this weight of history, bearing down on him. There were these poignant details, receiving last rites, being surrounded by religious relics, his daughter's plea to just let him die peacefully.
And then those final words. My God, how hard it is to die. It's a very humanizing moment.
It is.
Reminds us that even dictators face their own mortality.
It certainly does. And it leaves us with this sense of the magnitude of this moment. Here's a man who ruled Spain for decades, shaped its destiny, and now he's gone.
So we've seen Franco's grip on power loosen, his health fail, and those seeds of change starting to sprout. What happens next? How does Spain navigate this transition from dictatorship?
That's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at the immediate aftermath of Franco's death, the rise of Juan Carlos, and the early signs of transformation in Spanish society.
It's going to be fascinating.
It will be.
Last time, we left off with Franco on his deathbed, his final words echoing through a nation on the brink of change. All those years of rule coming to an end.
Right.
It makes you wonder, what was the mood like in Spain at that moment? Grief, uncertainty, maybe even some hope.
It must have been a really complex mix of emotions. The transcript actually describes a massive outpouring of mourners at Franco's funeral, hundreds of thousands of people.
Wow.
It really shows how deeply Francosm was embedded in Spanish society, even with all this change happening.
Yeah, that's a powerful image. Makes you think about what all those mourners were hoping for. What did they want the future to look like? And it's interesting, the transcript mentions Augusto Pinochet, the Chilean dictator,
Right.
was the only notable foreign dignitary at the funeral. What does that say about Franco's, standing in the world at that point?
I think it definitely points to a sense of isolation. Franco's Spain,
Hmm.
with all its internal struggles, had become increasingly out of sync with global politics. And then there's the whole imagery of Franco's burial in the Valley of the Fallen, a huge complex built by prisoners of war, many of whom were his political opponents. It's such a stark reminder of the contradictions in his legacy.
Almost like a physical embodiment of the divisions within Spain itself.
Yeah.
And speaking of legacy, the transcript goes right into Juan Carlos's proclamation as king. He swore to uphold the principles of the national movement, which basically means Franco's political ideology, embracing authoritarianism and nationalism. So at least on the surface, it sounds like just a continuation of the old regime.
Well, you have to remember that Juan Carlos was bound by the existing power structures. Spain was still very much under Franco's shadow.
Right.
There were powerful people in the government and military who wanted to keep things exactly the same.
Okay.
Juan Carlos had to be careful. He couldn't just come in and change everything overnight.
So was it all just a show? Was Juan Carlos secretly plotting to dismantle Franco's system?
It's a question that historians still debate today. What we do know is that things started changing. Subtly at first. Like, the transcript mentions Franco's former residence, El Pardo, being turned into a museum.
Oh, interesting.
It's a symbolic gesture, almost like they were closing a chapter on the past. A way of signaling that things would be different moving forward.
Like an attempt to relegate Franco to the history books.
Exactly.
But as we've seen, his influence was still very present.
Oh, yeah.
This tension between the past and the future is what makes this period so fascinating. You've got the weight of decades of authoritarian rule, but also these glimmers of change, these cracks in the foundation of Francoism. So how did those cracks grow wider? How did Spain break free from Franco's legacy and make that transition to democracy?
That's where things get really interesting. And while the transcript doesn't dive into the specifics, it does offer this key insight. Spain seems like it existed before, but everything is similar, but nothing is the same. It perfectly sums up that delicate balance of the early years.
So things appeared similar on the surface, but underneath, change was brewing.
Yeah,
That must have been a confusing time for many Spaniards.
absolutely. And that's what we'll focus on in the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore the key events, the political maneuvering, and those big societal shifts that shaped Spain's journey from dictatorship to democracy.
So we've seen Franco's power fade away, his death, and the transition to Juan Carlos. But how did Spain actually go from dictatorship to democracy? It seems like a huge leap.
Yeah, there's a lot that happened in between. And although our transcript doesn't really cover all those details,
Right.
it does offer a really insightful observation. It says, Spain seems like it existed before, but everything is similar, but nothing is the same. And I think that really captures those first few years after Franco.
So it looked the same on the surface, but underneath things were changing.
Exactly. Remember those divisions within the regime we discussed?
The immobilists and the aperturists.
Right. Those groups became even more prominent with Franco gone. And Juan Carlos, though initially bound to Franco's system, started to carefully maneuver around those different factions.
So he had to play both sides, appeasing the old guard while also pushing for reform.
Yeah, it was a delicate balancing act. And the transcript doesn't give us all the specifics,
Right.
but there were a lot of challenges. Pushback from Franco's hardliners, a struggling economy, even a military coup attempt in 1981.
A coup. That must have been terrifying for a country that was just beginning to embrace democracy.
Absolutely. It was a pivotal moment. And Juan Carlos's response was key. He denounced the coup, and he reaffirmed his commitment to democracy. It solidified his authority and sent a strong message. Spain was moving forward, not back to Franco's era.
So what were some of the concrete changes that happened during this transition? What did this shift to democracy actually look like for people?
It was a gradual process, for sure. But there were definitely some landmark events. The legalization of political parties,
Huge.
creation of a new constitution that embraced democratic principles,
Wow.
and free and fair elections in 1977, the first in over 40 years. Can you imagine the hope and excitement of voting after decades of oppression?
That's incredible. It seems like once things got moving, they changed pretty quickly. And it wasn't just political reforms, was it?
No, not at all. There were major cultural shifts as well.
Like what?
Well, for decades, Spanish society lived under strict censorship and repression. Suddenly, there was this explosion of freedom. Freedom of expression, artistic experimentation, open discussions about Spain's future. Think about the creativity and energy that must have been released.
It must have felt like a completely new beginning for a lot of people.
It was a chance to finally move on from the past and create something new.
It's amazing how resilient people can be. They went through all these complexities and challenges and ended up building a thriving democracy. It's a truly remarkable story.
It really is.
We've learned so much in this deep dive, from Franco's final years to the transition of power and Spain's journey to democracy. What would you say is the biggest takeaway?
I think for me, it's a reminder that history is complicated. It's rarely black and white.
Right.
It's full of competing forces and hidden agendas and surprises. But even when faced with enormous obstacles, there's always a potential for change, for progress.
For hope?
Exactly.
Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive, but before we go, I want to leave you with this thought. How do you, as an individual, deal with the legacy of a figure like Franco? How do you make sense of the good and the bad and everything in between? It's a question without easy answers, but it's worth thinking about as we reflect on this part of history and how it continues to shape Spain. Thanks for joining us today at Side Email.